Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. I think I've covered the time zones. Our colleague in Perth, it's 11 o'clock in the evening, I think. So welcome to the webinar linked to the launch of the book edited by Francois Cleophas, Critical Reflections on Physical Culture at the Edges of the Empire. I want to give you just a brief introduction to my colleague, Francois. Francois is a sport historian in South Africa, but I think his body of work really is coupled to and linked to giving voice to the margins in South Africa. And as we know, historically, sport and politics are totally intertwined. And in South Africa, it was even more so being coupled to policies and government initiatives around apartheid. And of course, beyond South Africa's borders, sport has always been an instrument of governments and rulers. And as we know, in terms of colonization, the colonists would export the sport and it would be part of the domination of the indigenous people. Coming back to Francois, I think his work is linked, and his academic project is linked to sport history and the history of those who have been marginalized, who have been oppressed, and who are still suffering under dominant discourses. And he has highlighted and foregrounded so many histories that would have gone unsaid had it not been for the kind of work that he's been working on. So I want to then say congratulations, Francois, to your second book in not a very long space of time. That's very well done. And again, for raising the issues, which I'm not going to go into, but I'll leave that to the experts, you know, the conceptualizations of the body, different ways of sport implementation, clothing, etc., and the way your authors have so brilliantly theorized the subjects in the book. So well done, Francois, and well done to all the contributors and colleagues. Our first speaker today, I'm going to move on to him now. It is Dr. Hendrick Snyders. Dr. Snyders is the head of Department of History at the National Museum in Bloemfontein. He's a prolific writer and is the author of over 30 journal articles, 3 books, including his recent monograph, Blitzboks, Rugby Sevens in South Africa, 1904 to 2019. He's the former curator and manager of the Springbok Experience Museum. Dr. Snyders, over to you.
Thank you, Professor Chris Reddy. Good evening or good afternoon, fellow colleagues, far and wide. Before I start, let me also formally convey my congratulations to Francois with the current publication. Now, colleagues and friends, my take on the publication will be structured around what I call the need for a first record. Now, in my hand, I have a little publication called The Allied Book of South African Sports and Sports Records, 1987 and 1988. So there were only 2 copies of this particular publication brought out in the days before democracy and before the unification of the racial bodies. But what is interesting about the Book of South African Sports and Sports Records is the following. It listed about 45 sporting codes of mostly white dominated sports. Only a small number of black athletes featured in this particular publication. Of the 45 sporting codes listed, only 16 codes have official histories or may have a historian specializing or working in that particular code. The great sadness is black history, black sports history, the history of black physical culture, by and large, remains non-existent or ignored or neglected. In fact, if I can make an example, in the field of black rugby, we have no more than 5 biographies or autobiographies. We have 2 general histories with all its mistakes. So against this background, we have a critical problem. The problem that certain myths continue to persist. Because there is officially no record of black excellence within the sports arena, we sit with a situation that some people still believe that blacks have no meaningful and significant sport tradition and legacy. So when the issue about blacks in certain sporting codes are handled within our context, everybody gets referred to as the product of affirmative action, the product of a transformation and development program, instead of a celebration of a long and meaningful sporting culture. A second persisting myth, and Francois also deals with it in the early part of his book, is the issue of that certain sports, in the mind of some South Africans, even today, soccer is still the best sport for black athletes. In rugby, we had a long debate about the size of black rugby players. Cheslin Colby is a case in point. So the persistent myth that certain sports are more suitable to certain others, and it's also applicable to the study of physical culture, continue to persist. And it was the persistence of the idea that sport and politics should not mix, as so eloquently referred to by the chairperson. So colleagues, my problem is that because there is this issue of archives and there is this issue of the fragmentation of what is available, we continue to see a situation where the history of black sports and black physical culture will remain on the agenda, will remain a contentious issue. And I ask myself, now that we find ourselves in a period where there's a debate about we should decolonize South Africa's history, be it the history of physical culture or the history of sports, where do we actually start? Is our aim to rewrite it? Or should we purge the existing record? Or should we rearrange it? Or should we Africanize it, as the other part of the debate goes? What exactly is it for us that needs to be done? And where do I place critical reflections in physical culture at the edge of empire within this context? For me, the key problem in our debate, and whether that debate deals about decolonization or anything else, is the issue of the absence of a first record of Black excellence in particular sports. If the Allied Book of South African Sports listed 45, and the Black presence amounts to only 5 or 6 cases, what is the implication of that for South Africa's national sports identity? And what is the responsibility of us as Black historians and South African historians in general? As a historian based in a museum, I'm frequently confronted with the issue of, but where is your history? You say you want to be equally represented in national teams, but where is your records? Where's your history? So the issue of first record becomes critically important. If we do not have the first record, how can we criticize the dominant narrative that weightlifting and bodybuilding was predominantly, even exclusively, a white enterprise? When we deal with the issue of boots on the feet of a cricketer, is that not also the story of South African sports in many instances? We are confronted with the problem of the first record as a source of evidence, and from where we could actually begin our reconstruction, our decolonization, our criticism, our critique, in my view. I think Critical Reflections is a timeless publication. It's also a necessary publication. And in my view, I think it attempts to do 3 things. It attempts to create a first record for us. A first record about the likes of Ron Eland, a first record about the exploits of the likes of David Isaac. But it also tells us, and it gives us a first record about Black mountaineers and their engagement with their leisure practice and the power relations underlying that. So Critical Reflections as a first record is absolutely critical within the context of the fact that, as far as the current situation goes, we need to reassert and make the point that Blacks have a significant tradition and legacy in sports. I think Critical Reflections is also important for its attempt to foreground the story of the marginalized, the excluded, the ignored, and also the often insulted. It's also commended for its attempt to amplify the voices of those whose achievement were either ignored or continue to be ignored, or gets pushed to the side, or sometimes even turned into a subject of myth. But it's also important for its attempt to insert the contribution of Black communities and marginalized communities into the main narrative. Because it helps to place David Isaacs on the same level as his peer Arnold Schwarzenegger. It places Ron Eland on the same level as his fellow competitors in the 48 Olympic Games and all other Olympians. Something that before this publication was actually a piece of neglected history. And last but not least, it attempts to deal with some of the persisting myths. And that to me is a critical important one. So for me, the fact that it is the first move towards a first record as a basis for our further conversation, and our conversation with the future is of critical importance. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Dr. Snyders. And I find your introduction of the construct of a first record a very interesting one. Thank you for locating the book in terms of that. Okay, our next contributor is Professor Douglas Booth. Let me introduce him briefly. Professor Booth background is in the history, sociology.
Yes. I don't know if Professor Booth is here.
Oh.
I am here, Francois.
Sorry.
He just slipped out for a coffee earlier.
Apologies.
Okay, I'll recommence with that. Thank you. Professor Douglas Booth has his background in the history, sociology, and politics of sport. And he has worked with two of the leading scholars in the field, Colin Tatz and John Lloyd. His interests include the politics of sport, sporting cultures, race and sport, extreme sports, nature sports, history and historiography of sport. His major publications include The Race Game, Sport and Politics in South Africa, a 1998 publication, Australian Beach Cultures, The History of Sun, Sand and Surf, 2001, and The Field, Truth and Fiction in Sport History, 2005. He has a long-standing interest in the beach as a site of physical culture, and Douglas Booth is currently investigating the beach as an intersection between nature and culture, and the ways that scholars present this intersection today and have represented it in the past. Professor Booth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, and good evening to Francois, particularly to Hendrik and Ray, and to everyone attending this launch, wherever you may be in the world. Let me begin by extending hearty congratulations to Francois and all the contributors, and to Sun Press on the publication of Critical Reflections. Thank you, Francois, for the opportunity to talk about your collection. Critical Reflections on Physical Culture from the Edges of Empire and Society highlights several emerging trends in sport history. And this evening, I want to just briefly comment on two of those trends. One of the goals of Critical Reflections, as Hendrik pointed out, is to capture the voices of ordinary people from the past, the people who traditional histories of sport have generally overlooked. The phrase in the title, Edges of Empire and Society, is especially apt in this regard. For example, in his chapter, Bats, Balls and Boards, Malcolm McLean notes that narratives of surfboard riding are primarily told from the point of view and the interests of the North American leisure and tourism industries. rarely from the point of view of Hawaiian surfers, whose skills and lifestyles, leisure and tourism industries have sought to commodify. In seeking the voices of ordinary people, Critical Reflections challenge and debunk many of the assumptions in traditional nationalist and modernisation narratives of physical culture. As Malcolm reminds us, the grand narrative of surfing stumbles on numerous fronts. The grand narrative ignores the presence of surfing across the Pacific. The grand narrative overstates the death of surfing in the 19th century Hawaii under the weight of prohibitions by foreign missionaries. And the grand narrative silences Indigenous engagements with surf in Asia, Africa, Australia, New Zealand and South America. And this is precisely what Hendrik was referring to in his introduction and his comments on Critical Reflections, the absence of this, this voice of people who are engaging in physical culture from their perspective. Critiques such as these also point to a second prevailing theme within contemporary sport history, namely the investigation of the phenomenological implications and the epistemology and ontology of embodied cultures within matrices of power. Again, this is a focus of Critical Reflections, with contributors interrogating the connections between the body and society. Patricia Vatinsky has long been urging historians of sport to pay more attention to the embodied nature of power. Not surprisingly, her contribution with Aishwarya Ramachandran explores this issue further in an analysis of the YMCA in India and China. Several contributors also pursue this theme in South Africa, and their work reveals that sport historians are changing the way they analyse embodied power. Early historical work in South Africa emphasised one of two perspectives. On the one hand, in the eyes of the coloniser, black bodies were unsuited to the embodied culture of modern codified sport. And again, Hendrik emphasised this point in his comments. In this view, black bodies were mere children, served only as ancillary labour, or were entirely dehumanised as barefooted natives. On the other hand, a liberal perspective referred to the cultural mimicry of the colonised and their imitation of bodily deportment, accent and vocabulary. In this view, the colonised allegedly deemed mimicry a prerequisite for social acceptance, advancement and status in the colonial world. In the liberal view, black bodies joined sports clubs to perform and display corporeal skills, or they sought administrative positions in sports clubs to perform and display their language skills. Critical Reflections embraces a more historiographically nuanced approach to the issue of embodied power. Benjamin Sachs' examination of different interpretations of footwear is a good example of the increasingly nuanced approaches to embodiment. Rather than questions of embodied suitability or mimicry in physical culture, contemporary historians examine colonised subjects as actors or agents. In this framework, the colonised is neither necessarily victim nor imitator. Instead, the colonised used physical culture for political ends or simply embodied satisfactions to become, in Francois' words, whatever they wished. As Tony Collins writes, the colonised subject may have mimicked the coloniser or adopted the coloniser's cultural habits and institutions, but the result was never simple reproduction. Congratulations again to Francois and the contributors to Critical. Your text is a clear expression of the sentiment widely shared in contemporary sport history that the field should contain a political dimension and that the past is grounded in contradictions and conflict, that the past is replete with structures and relationships of power, and that the past is riven with discrimination, subjugation, exploitation, and abuse. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Professor Booth. Yeah, I think the narratives of surfers are particularly something that have been misrepresented. I agree with all the others, but I'm just saying the surfing crowd, right? Okay, our next speaker is Wray Vamplew. Wray is an emeritus professor of sports history at the University of Stirling, where he was appointed as Scotland's first chair in sports history and is a global professorial fellow at the University of Edinburgh. He has authored and edited more than 20 books, including Numbers and Narratives, Sport History and Economics. It's 2018 publication. Cultural History, Sociology of Sport and Leisure, Cultural Sociology, or Areas of Interest, and he's also the author of Mud, Sweat and Beers, editor of A Cultural History of Sport, and this journal, there have been 6 volumes, which have covered various ages, from BC, medieval age, the Renaissance, the Age of Enlightenment, Age of Industry, and the modern age, which is 1920 to the present. Okay, so it's over to Professor Vamplew.
Thanks, Chris. The problem with being third speaker on a panel is that many of my points obviously have been stolen by Hendrik and Doug, but I still wish them well. This anthology highlights several themes in which sport, as it's been promoted historically, emerges in a very poor light. And let me look at a couple of these. First one is that one of the principles of modern sport, as defined in the 7 characteristics enunciated many years ago by Alan Gutman, was that of equality. However, when we look at it as historians, we find that it really only applies to the constitutive rules of sport, those which regulate how participants should play the game physically. It tells us what is prescribed and what is proscribed. For example, then, everyone plays with the same shape of rugby ball. No one is allowed to step into the bunker where the ball has gone in golf, pick it up and throw it down the fairway. And I say this with feeling because not being able to do that ruined my game on Thursday morning. However, equality may apply to the rules. It does not apply to the participants themselves. And this comes out very clearly in this book. Here, what we might term auxiliary rules, which are set by sports associations, by event organizers, and in some cases by political authorities. These rules determine who is eligible to play in the first place, who can participate. And in too many instances, this is based not on sporting ability, but on social and political factors. Now, in many respects, that discrimination occurs in sport should not surprise us. Discrimination is endemic in society, and inevitably this will be reflected in a society's leisure activities. Chris mentioned that I've just been general editor for a 6-volume cultural history of sport dating back to antiquity. And one chapter in each volume looks at discrimination in sport, and it's there with the Greeks, it's there with the Egyptians, and coming forward, it's there in the modern age. The evidence is that people prefer to play sport, prefer to do anything really, with like-minded individuals. They prefer to create what we call bonding social capital rather than the bridging social capital which crosses the boundaries created by religion, ethnicity, gender, politics, class, or race. But once you start including only some, this necessitates excluding others. And such exclusion, but one imposed by ruling political powers, is a focus of much of this book. A book which, it should be stressed, as Doug did before me, is not solely about Black South African sport. It does look, in the words of Hendrik, at the marginalized, the excluded, more generally around the world. And this theme leads me to my second observation, and one again that is picked up throughout the book. It's that those in power, in sport and in government, often claim that sport and politics do not mix. It's very clear from this book that they do. They claim that sport is apolitical and is not a suitable setting for the expression of political opinions and protests. And we can see this in the recent legislation coming out of the Tokyo Olympics, where athletes have been told not to protest on the podium. Now, these people that say that are doubly wrong. They're wrong, firstly, because simply saying that politics should be kept out of sport or that the status quo should be preserved are political statements in themselves. And secondly, they're wrong because the reality is, as the book shows, that sport and politics are deeply intertwined. But that they're intertwined does not mean that they mix well. So I've had to go to the dark side of sport that emerges from the book. On the more positive side, and this has been emphasized by the previous speakers, I think I pick out three things that are good. One is that the book shows that there has been resistance to the established government and political order by the so-called marginalized athletes. Secondly, it's a version of sports history written not by those with the central metropolitan view, but by those, as the title suggests, or to modify the title slightly, at the edges of the intellectual sporting empire. And thirdly, the book gives gives a hearing to those whose voices have been largely unknown and unheard in the past. The book provides a counterpoint to the conventional, often racist narrative, and shows that the oppressed and marginalized often had a sporting role of their own making. Finally, let me say, I was one of the referees for the initial proposal of this book, which of course I supported, or I wouldn't have been here today to talk about the published version. But I'm pleased to report that this published version is a far superior product to the one that was first proposed. And I recommend it heartily to anyone interested in sport, politics, and justice. Indeed, I would recommend it to anyone who cares about sport and about people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Vamplew. And I want to thank all three speakers for sticking to their time. It was a prize for doing it in the shortest time. We'd have first, second, and third, wouldn't we? I think it does give me a minute or two just to delve into the blurb. And I think I just want to touch on some of them. Professor Janice Todd says this, which echoes and resonates with what the three speakers have said today. The groundbreaking anthology provides a transnational view of the use of physical culture practices to strengthen, discipline, and reimagine the human body. I'll take the next one. It's distinguished Professor Leslie Lagrange, colleague of ours at Stellenbosch. This is an important book and essential to our understanding of the history of the development of the physical body through exercise. Written from and about The Many Edges of the Empire. This collection of essays is critical, nuanced, and provocative. Cleophas has done well to bring together the ideas of some of the great thinkers on the topic. And then Bruce Kidd, the important collection illuminates the unequal power relations that empowered the spread of colonial forms of sport and physical culture throughout the global South. Through carefully researched case studies, it also shows how courageous individuals and groups try to turn these activities into expressions of their own agency, subversion, and even resistance. Okay, right now it's a slot for Vikas from the publisher.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Prof. Reddy. Just a quick note. Thank you, everybody, for joining the launch and for this wonderful engagement on a very important topic. I just want to note, I shared in the chat where the book is available from. It's available on most platforms, Google Books, Takealot, ITSI, Amazon. It's also available through ProQuest, EBSCOhost, and very soon also through JSTOR. So please go out and buy the book. It's available in print and electronic format internationally. Thank you and enjoy the rest of the launch.
Thank you, Vikas. And just again, thank you to the three presenters for your inputs. Thank you very much. Okay, the next section on the program, we bring in some individuals, movements and collectives, and alternative approaches, environment and physical culture. Those are other sections with in the book. So, Francois, we stick into our program. There's been no change. Okay. So first up would be Andrew Eland. And Andrew is the son of Ron Eland. Got it right? Yes. Creating a Decolonizing South African Physical Culture Archive, a case study of Ron Eland. Andrew, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Dr. Cleophas, honored guests, and everyone tuned in internationally. This is truly a great honor and privilege to be involved in this opportunity to speak on behalf of the Eland family. It's going to be a bit personal, but it's namely Cynthia Eland, my mother, my sister, and Alta Eland and Dana Eland. They both reclaimed their surnames, by the way. And also posthumously, on behalf of my late brother, Ron Eland Jr., who lost his battle with cancer in 2001. And I would also like to mention that there are 10 grandchildren within our family, mostly in Canada, and my 2 beautiful daughters in Johannesburg. Okay, the clearest way I can describe Ron Eland is maybe in 3 words. He was an athlete, a scholar, and most importantly, a loving, caring family man. And his pursuit to become the best in his craft in the 1940s must have been a tremendous task, not just physically, but I think socially as well. I mean, to his peers, I thought that they must say, what is this guy doing? He's, he's working laboriously, stressfully, and for no profit. And that must have been quite curious for everybody at the time, just thinking about the era. But only my father knew and had the set insight for his goal of being the very best weightlifter and bodybuilder in his class across racial barriers, which then qualified him for the 1948 Olympic Games in England. A goal no one else could even fathom at the time, considering the rigid governance of the land, restricting any persons of color from even dreaming of such prominence. Ron Eland, however, rose above all that. And throughout hard work, determination, and his magnetic social skills, right, he charmed everyone in sight, including people like Milo Pillay, and with his shoe-like multi-system, created a path to his international recognition in the art of weightlifting. And today we formalize this work within physical culture and the book that has been launched. Now, after returning from the Olympics in 1948, my father, Ron Eland, then married Cynthia Daniels, and then raised 4 children. And it was my mother and her love for Ronald Eland which availed his freedom to pursue his passion for physical culture. My father then became a teacher and taught at Batchwood School in Wynberg, Cape Town. And all the while engaging in promoting sport, specifically physical culture, through many, many organizations, including Innes Road, the Youth Center, William Herbert Sports Ground, which got me into the athletics there, which was really, really quite special. And if you look at the cover of this wonderful book that's being launched, you will notice that there is a photo of Mr. Cleophas' mother in one of the physical culture maneuvers, which is, my father has the exact same picture actually. And the coincidence is that my father actually taught Mrs. Cleophas and the man, I forget his name, that is a holder in that position, which is quite classic for them. Oh, but I digress. In his constant shrew-like endeavors, he had made difficult choice to have to leave South Africa to find greener pastures. And then he found himself in Washington, D.C., with his cousin Cecil February, which is also mentioned in the book. And this situation also caused him to have to stay in America for 4 years. But within his confidence and trust in his strong family bond, this gave us all trust in his mission. And we had no question but to expect a positive outcome. And it totally came out absolutely clean. Then in 1974, we all met in Washington, D.C. There were hugs, there were kisses, there were tears. It was unbelievable. I think it was the first time I ever saw my father actually cry, you know? And then I remember saying to him, well, you know, it's great to be here, but it smells funny here in America, you know? 11-year-old, bright-eyed John Wayne lived there. It was amazing. But because of my father's, again, unwielding charm, never burning any of his bridges, he was still able to pack our living together and literally sell our house and get out of the country within days, because the government literally said to us, you have 2 weeks to leave, otherwise you can't go. And we went. And again, in his goal of eagerness, just before we got there, he visited a friend in Toronto, Canada. And then within the drop of a hat, we just said, that's it. We're not staying in Washington. We're going to Canada. And that's one of the greatest moves ever, because being a Canadian was amazing. 4 years later, we all became Canadian. And thank you, Dad, for that again. Again, within my dad's work, he was relentless. He worked as a janitor at the YMCA. Then basically got his degrees in sociology and anthropology. He then became a teacher and taught science, social science. Within the next 3 to 4 years, he was continuously consulting and facilitating joining the Canadian Olympic team. We worked as a masseuse and as an assistant coach. His passion for his physical culture never wavered, often demonstrating handstands in people's living rooms continuously. This was quite a thing for us. But it was a visit to South Africa in 2003 that he literally walked himself to a hospital, checked in at reception. They sent him to the emergency ward. They checked in and then immediately booked him into ICU. A few weeks later, we all were beside him holding hands, and then we lost the great Ron Eland, world champion, and he would never lift again, love again, or charm again. But on behalf of the Eland family, we would like to say that we fully endorse this book, and it's a great critical reflection on physical culture, as it says, at the edges of the empire and society. And we are proud of the hard work of Dr. Cleophas that is done in every matter, including archiving all of my father's memorabilia at the Stellenbosch University, which is just so fantastic. And thank you to everybody that helped to guide and develop this book to this point, that's including Dr. Marshall Linus Theophas and Yannick Schwalding, excuse me for the mispronunciation. And the amount of coincidence that happens generally lends itself to a biography, because it started with a thesis with Dr. Cleophas, and now it's a chapter, and I think naturally progresses to a book, maybe a movie, maybe a series. I could play my dad. No, just I jest, okay? But again, I say to you, literally, technically, physically, Ron Eland broke the chains that bound him and found himself on an international stage. And after 73 years, Ronald William Eland strikes again. That's legendary, ipso facto. Thank you all for your indulgence. Please be safe in these trying times, and I relinquish my time back to the speaker. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you. Dr. Cleophas, you're going to be talking to us about the shaping, very catchy title, the shaping of non-racial bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is all about shaping. Sorry, that's a very limited understanding.
Sorry, are you speaking to me?
Francois, can you unmute your microphone? No, I was just making a general comment.
Thank you. Thank you. My chapter in the book that I have, it's a life story about a Cape Town-based bodybuilder. Ron Eland pushed open a door in the 48 games, Olympic Games. A next generation contemporary of his, and I have a photo of the two of them together on a boat, is David Isaacs, who pushed that door a bit further in the 1960s when he competed in the Mr. World bodybuilding competition. So this chapter, it's a first record account, as Dr. Hendrik Snyder mentioned, of a historically significant South African bodybuilder, David Isaacs, and his community. And I'm going to read one sentence from the chapter, and then I'm going to ask one of my students, Ms. Amy Apollos, just to read one of the paragraphs. David Isaacs' childhood was shaped by influences of church, community, and material poverty. Much the same as the previous encounter. So, Ms. Apollos, will you maybe just take us through the paragraphs on page 43 and page 44?
Good evening, everyone. I will read from page 43. Isaacs laid out his career as follows. I started training in Newlands at the age of 18, a very young age, and I only weighed 112 pounds. That's 50 kilograms. I was very thin, and we started training in the backyard with very few weights. Can you imagine weighing 50 kilograms at the age of 18? When I competed, I was 246 kilograms. It can be done. We were about 12 youngsters together. I started the Oakdale Bodybuilding Club in 1956 in Newlands. We clubbed some money together and bought one set of weights. 12 guys had to train with that one set of weights. It was difficult, but we produced champions. Edward Isaacs won the Mr. Junior South Africa for 3 years in succession. We also had Gerald Lawrence, who won Mr. Junior Western Province. We had Johnny Benson, who won Mr. Junior South Africa. We were the best club in South Africa because we won all the senior and junior titles. We started from humble beginnings in that backyard. The Western Province Weightlifting and Bodybuilding Union had been established by 1956. Farnese, Oakdale, Olympic clubs were affiliated members. Farnese, that's where Ron Eland and Precious McKenzie come from. I remember Ampi Daris from Farnese. He also passed away. In later years, he was chairman of the Western Province Union. His daughter was Shireen Daris, who also won Miss Western Province. My daughter, Amanda, also won this title 2 years in a row and was runner-up Miss South Africa. Most of the people who died started the club with me. We were school kids at the time, very young. However, we joined up with the union and we won all the provincial titles, juniors and seniors, and we succeeded in becoming the best club in South Africa. My first Mr. Western Province title I won in 1963, and I won it 12 years in succession. After that, I took some time off to spend with my family. I initially planned it to be 1 year, but it ended up being 5 years. I then made a comeback and won the Mr. Western Province title after a 5-year layoff, winning it for the 13th time. I competed in London at the Mr. Universe competition in 1966. That's the year I competed against Arnold Schwarzenegger. In 1969, I competed again in the Mr. Universe in London and Mr. World in Belgium. In 1996 was my last international competition in Italy, where I competed in the Mr. World competition. I competed in the Masters division. I was 58 years old, the oldest competitor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that Dr. Cleophas, you coming back in?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes.
Yes, no, that is it. And just to mention that David Isaacs, up until today, as I spoke to him last week, he still remains committed to working with the poor. He's got a gymnasium on the Cape Flats that is attended by mainly migrant workers. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna to just insert this. Ambidaris was my neighbor. I know the Farnies Bodybuilding Club very well. They operated in a converted garage for many, many years. And his daughter and the other people you mentioned were products of a converted garage that served as a gym and a bodybuilding, facility for bodybuilders. Okay, our next speakers, get my pronunciation right here. They are in the section of movements and collectives. It's Premysl Soldiers and Lubisi's companions on gender and the limits of female emancipation in the Sokol Gymnasium movement. Martin Clement and Jan Pesda. Are you with us? Martin and Jan? Because you know something about this?
I do not see Martin on the list, so I think we should go to the next speaker.
Sure. Thank you. Steeplechase, personal reflections on Fit to Run's race of life. This is Tamanda Carr and Norman Onton. There you go. Thank you.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I am speaking on behalf of Norman as well about the chapter. Thank you again, Francois, and everyone for inviting to the book, inviting us and giving space to speak about one chapters in the book, and for the opportunity to publish with you. Thank you so much. I hope everyone attending would have the opportunity to buy. I'm going to give a little background about how this chapter, which actually very, very brief story of Norman on. It's an athletics program which draws engage Cape Flats based in Worcester, so gangs.
I think we lost you there, Samanda. Is that right, Vikas?
Yes, she lost the connection. So let's go to the next speaker.
Okay. That'll be Dr. Paul Hendricks, Re-engaging Non-Racial Sport, the Teachers League of South Africa and the school sport movement in the Western Cape from 1956 to 1994. Paul?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Reddy. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you loud and clear on my side.
Okay. Firstly, thank you to Francois and all his collaborators in achieving this milestone with his book. I think it's quite an achievement, being aware of Francois' battles over the years in attempting to make sure that the voice of those on the ground are heard and linked up globally with other struggles in other parts of the world. So I think it's a huge feat in that regard. And it gives true meaning to the notion of linking the local to the global. In my chapter, which essentially is part of a PhD thesis that I put together in the late 2000 period, I looked and focused specifically on the Teachers League of South Africa and its involvement in the region known to those in South Africa, of course, as the Western Cape. And internationally, I hope that our followers are able to identify that region within South Africa and Southern Africa and the broader African continent. It's a story that's not well known, that of the Teachers League, and even less known is the story of the teachers involved in the school sports movement at the time. And of course, for many people within the country, the notion of non-racialism is a term that is known and is bandied about quite often, but within the international arena, it may come across more as a term associated with anti-racism. Just to point out in the little bit of time that I have, and in a nutshell, that when dealing with the Teachers League and non-racial sport, I've attempted to compress into about 4 decades a long history of involvement in school sport by a relatively small group of teachers. And though they were a small group, the impact was quite widespread. It was not just simply one in which the Western Cape was involved, but across many provinces within South Africa at the time, as part of the anti-establishment organizations or bodies within the liberation movement. So some of the terms and some of the organizations may come across as a bit difficult to necessarily remember, but in short, the Teachers League was part of a broader umbrella body called the Non-European Unity Movement, and it found its origins in 1943, 44 period, and the Teachers League found itself as part of a federal structure then, and it was linked to the anti-CAD movement. By the 1950s, to cut a long story short, we had the introduction of the Suppression of Communism Act, and with it, a tremendous amount of opposition to voices within the liberation movement. But then, of course, the Teachers League was fairly established within the Western Cape amongst certain schools, And one has to also keep in mind, of course, that the introduction of mass schooling by the apartheid regime in the 50s allowed for a larger participation of teachers within various facets of civil society. And the birth, as it were then, of the Western Province Senior School Sports Union, and then later, a year later, the Western Province School Sports Board, allowed for teachers who were community-minded, socially minded, and politically minded to become more involved in activities on the ground. And it's really within this framework of the origins of the Western Province Senior School Sports Union that we see the emergence of three tenets of the unity movement that to some degree played a role in the development of non-racial sport and particularly school sport. So we have, for instance, non-racialism as one of the central tenets of the sports movement, along with non-collaboration, which was one of the founding policies of the unity movement, of which the TLSA was a part, as I mentioned earlier, and the use of the boycott as a weapon in struggle. By the 1960s, the effectiveness, or by the late 60s, the effectiveness of these particular thoughts and this thinking found its resonance within the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee, SANROC, under Dennis Brutus, and a range of other activists at the time internationally. And then, of course, later on within the South African Council on Sport, which in effect later adopted a policy called the Double Standards Resolution. So the article, in a sense, attempts to trace some of those threads that I've mentioned. It then looks briefly at the impact of, for instance, the Double Standards Resolution, along with non-racialism, within the school sport movement, and points out clearly that it no longer was just simply a matter of fighting against apartheid, but also fighting against the class component of what was happening in South African society at the time. The Double Standards Resolution, for instance, at the time prevented any people who were within the sports movement and those outside of it as well, who were in sympathy and who supported it, not to take part or be party to having their children attend private schools, attending any institution that may have had the permit system. In other words, a system that allowed people of color to attend particular institutions, and also prevented those athletes, of course, who wanted to participate in South Africa from doing so. And so the DSR, of course, was linked to the Glen Eagles Agreement. I don't want to go into the details of that. Thank you. But just to point out, with the Glen Eagles Agreement, of course, as people would know, South Africa was effectively barred from participating in international sport. And the role of SACOS and SANROC in that is well known to certain individuals, but I've tried to bring it across in the article and connect it, of course, to school sport. Of course, the DSR was important in terms of its radical component outside of school sport, within the workers' movement as well. And we know that school sport was very much effective in the boycott of the 1980s of the in the workers' struggles, what they call the Roundtree Workers Boycott and the Simba Chips, amongst others. Then, of course, critical to all of this was when negotiations took place by the 1980s, the school sports movement found itself, of course, part of the SACOS opposition to those who tried to participate in a tricameral parliament of by 1983-84. And then, of course, with all of these, later on, the DSR also resulted in sport, in particular, splitting along the lines of what was then referred to as the National Sports Congress and the South African Council on Sport. So sorry, in attempting to bring this across in a very compacted way, in the late 1980s, the DSR, as effective as it was in radicalizing the sports movement, also saw the split in the sports movement because of it. And by the 1990s, with the negotiation process underway, we see it effectively coming under serious attack when the NSC, the National Sports Congress, goes into negotiations with the establishment school bodies. School sport, of course, is very much part of this. And by 1994, it succumbs to the political pressures that go with the negotiation process, and of course, the arrival of the new South Africa. And that's where my article, in a sense, ends, with, of course, the formation of the United, with USASA, United School Sports Union of South Africa, and unfortunate then demise of senior school sports, and it's what was called the multi-code approach to sport as opposed to the single code approach. I just want to end on this note that as a teacher, firstly, my unfortunate sadness is to see when I attend senior school sports, the divide between schools that have come out of a single code and those who have come out of a multi-code sport. Because we do not have the participation of all schools equally, simply because certain schools still follow the single code approach, and those who have come from the senior school sports tradition still bring all the scholars to events. And we noticed that, of course, despite our attempts to build a nation and to develop a non-racial ethic within South Africa and social cohesion, it has not happened that way. So on that note, the article ends, but I think it does present many opportunities for researchers to take this type of study further. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I think we can, Tamanda, are you sorted with your connection?
Yeah, I think it's better now. You
Okay.
have to tell me, can you hear me clearly?
I can hear you. I hope everybody else can.
Okay.
We're going to be tight on the 5 minutes, please.
I'm going to take only 2 minutes or maximum.
Keep going. We have 5.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm not going to repeat what I said. I just want to actually move to say how we came about, Norman and I came about writing this chapter, and there is a lot more work still to be done and published on this organization that Norman founded and runs. It's called Fit to Run. So the chapter actually introduces the organization in Norman's own words and his own engagement to it. So I met Norman in 2012 while doing my doctoral fieldwork. And when I first met him, it sounded like any other sports for development organization, which, you know, like there are so many in Cape Town. And they were catering for underprivileged young athletes. But what actually struck me, what was so unique about what he did, or what this organization represents, it was unlike others. It wasn't just somebody coming from outside and saying, right, there's a development project we need to, this is for the development of Africa. It came from the spirit of his own historical background, growing up in a colored community with parents who were keen athletes, and this is what you did. And I don't need to say too much because I know a lot of the presenters and attendees know this experience of community sports and how their parents and their grandparents were engaged in sport. And then, so rather than what Norman does as a special NPO project, it's what was so striking about or important about his organization is it's not a sport for development project which kind of follows this international idea or discovery that sport can be used for development, but it's a continuation of a particular history, which I feel Francois' work is so committed to bring out those Black histories. So it's a continuation. So what the chapter does is a very, very brief reflection or oral history of his organization, his own life, and how he comes about working with the athletes. The point which I kind of wanted to emphasize was every time Norman had the platform to talk about his organization, he spoke about his athletes and how amazing they were doing and their times and everything. And a lot of the times when we engaged, he and I engaged, he would be talking about how, about the micro-political struggles he was in. And I always thought they were so much more important to be brought out because yes, his athletes are doing really well, but those records are recorded. What is not recorded and the challenges he faced on everyday basis, that was the story I really wanted to write as a researcher. So this chapter kind of brings out that negotiation between two of us, where for him, it's his achievements, and for me, it's the struggles and the political fights he has been part of. And that's the tension which the chapter kind of brings out. So that's my teaser, and I hope attendees who haven't read the book will buy the book and engage with us to take this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tamanda. I'm glad we were able to reconnect. Thank you. Okay, so we move on to the next section of the book, Alternative Approaches. And the chapter that will be discussed of boots and bare feet, footwear, race and civilization in Australian sport before World War II. Benjamin Sachs.
Thanks, Professor Reddy. Can everyone hear me clearly?
I hear you. I take it everyone does. Thank you.
Excellent. Great. Well, hello, everyone. Excuse me. It's really great to be joining you all today from Perth on the west coast of Australia. Just a little bit about me quickly. I'm a lecturer at Curtin University.
Okay, keep going.
Yeah, you're good?
No, go.
You go. Yep. So just a little bit about me quickly. I'm a lecturer at Curtin University here in Perth. In terms of my research focus, I'm broadly interested in social and cultural legacies of empire, and especially sport and physical culture, but also things like music, religion, dress, that kind of thing. And more particularly, I'm interested in how certain cultural practices, like sport and dress, became contested spaces in which different groups pursued their own distinctive interests in the context of empire. And on a personal level, I like sport and I like shoes. And I think that focus, both personally and professionally, is very much apparent in my chapter for this volume, which is entitled Of Boots and Bare Feet, Footwear, Race and Civilization in Australian Sport Before World War II. Now, in the chapter, I considered the different ways that feet and footwear were understood and depicted in Australian sport. So in my chapter, we move away from the South African context, but we touch on many of the same themes of power and contest that the previous authors have touched upon in their brief descriptions. So in my chapter, I proceed in two steps. First, I use feet and footwear to tell a story that's not particularly new, the history of white Australian sport. I look at newspaper reporting, changes in the rules, first-hand accounts, and I look at what we can infer from how people described and represented sporting footwear and the lack of sporting footwear on the field. And in the chapter, I argue that at both an individual level and a societal level, bare white feet, at least among adult Australians, signified a lack of sophistication and class that was at odds with both maturity and modernity. So bare feet was seen as sort of a peculiar thing that was at best tolerated and most of the time was basically criticized, banned, or banished to the past, something that, you know, we used to do when we were sort of a young nation, but we don't do it anymore. But frankly, I don't think my chapter would really fit into this collection if that's the story that I told. The second part of the chapter turns to a different, more marginal and more marginalized history, the history of non-white sport in Australia. And in particular, it considers the meanings and representations of bare feet among Aboriginal sports people and visiting players from the Pacific Islands, from India and elsewhere. And what I find is that the ways that these sports people were represented and described was very different indeed. And in particular, white writers and audiences generally accepted and actually encouraged bare black and brown feet on the field. And in some cases, they even invented the existence of bare feet that just didn't exist to confirm their expectations about uncivilized peoples. But I also find that many non-European athletes in Australia understood that white audiences wanted to see this, that they wanted these demonstrations of comic primitivism. And they also understood that if they played the part, if they provided these kinds of opportunities, then that basically meant that they could benefit by playing the part, and they could obtain money, goods, status, and social access. So in my account, there's agency as well as subordination. Now, obviously I'm biased, but I think these stories are really revealing. I really hope that the chapter encourages other historians of sport and physical culture to consider the value of focusing on sporting attire, whether it's shoes, or other forms of physical attire, whatever it might be. By considering the way that players dress and the way that their dress is controlled, we can cast new light on the ways that power operates through sport and indeed through society. And more specifically, I hope that the chapter shows that a focus on dress can assist in decolonizing physical culture at the edges of empire. By interrogating colonized people's attitudes towards sporting dress, we move past the colonial implication that any differences in attitudes and practices was rooted in either primitiveness or ignorance. And by doing this, we can also begin to uncover the agency of athletes who decided to dress and, of course, play in different ways to how colonizers said that they should. And the last thing I'll say before I pass the conch shell across is just to say that it's really been a privilege for me to be part of this project. Not only is it important and timely, as a lot of the other contributors have already mentioned, it's also filled with high quality contributions from a diverse cast of scholars around the world, as well as obviously focused in South Africa. So I'm personally truly humbled to see my contribution in this company. So much hard work has gone into the compilation, and Francois deserves so much credit for conceiving of the idea and then pulling everything together with such aplomb. So to Francois, via Dunky, and to everyone else, via the book. Thank you.
Thank you for your clever ending.
A pun in Afrikaans is not something I thought I'd be doing, but here I am.
Okay. I'm sure you've met some South Africans. There's a saying here, there are many South Africans packing for Perth. Anyway.
Including.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, let's move on. Environment and physical culture. No, sorry, we're still here with alternative approaches. Health for the masses, physical culture, radio, and the state of 1930s Ireland. Connor Heffernan?
Yep, that's me. So, hi everyone.
Hello.
Greetings from a very overcast Ireland, and thank you very much for having me today. Francois, again, congratulations on this fantastic collection, and thank you again for letting me be a part of this. I will just open by saying Francois very kindly gave a guest lecture for me earlier this year. I think it was up at 1 or 2 a.m. So I'm very sorry that I can't exhibit the same sort of commitment because it's only 5 o'clock here in Ireland. So eventually you'll have me up past my bedtime. But to begin, I will hopefully share what was once one of the most exciting things to happen in Ireland. Well, certainly one of the most exciting things to happen in the 1930s. And this was the development of so-called physical culture in the then Irish Free State. So as a quick primer and an introduction into the chapter, so-called physical culture is a form of physical culture that originated in Czechoslovakia in the 19th century, and from there kind of spread throughout a lot of Europe throughout the early 1900s. Now, the interesting thing about Sokol is it came to the Irish Free State in the 1930s, and from there it became enmeshed, interspersed, and actually a propaganda tool for the Irish Free State to promote a new identity for the country. The Irish Free State attained independence from Great Britain in 1921 and was really in the political wilderness for 10 to 15 years, struggling to establish a clear, distinct Gaelic Irish identity. And the chapter that's published in the book, and also part of my research that it stemmed from, argued that the Irish Free State attempted to use things like so-called physical culture, things like sport, to promote an identity for the Irish Free State as fit, healthy, and indeed modern. So I will unfortunately stop our so-called demonstration. If you want to do any of the exercises in your own room, do feel free. But moving from so-called to the actual chapter itself, the chapter in this collection looks at how the Irish Free State attempted to use things like so-called physical culture to encourage a sense of Irishness within the Irish people, but also to encourage physical culture and physical activity among the population. And it does so primarily through the radio. Now, I know radio is now an old medium for many people, but in the 1930s, the radio was television, Instagram, YouTube, and all of these things rolled into one. And the Irish Free State, concerned with the physical fitness of its citizenry, attempted, sponsored, and coordinated several high-profile physical activity programs to be rolled out throughout the country. So for me, the point of interest in this, and something which hopefully situates the chapter neatly into the collection, was the internationalism, the transnationalism, the global concerns which underpin this introduction of so-called radio programs within the Irish Free State. Now, although Ireland was a neutral country during the 1930s, we don't like to take sides, they nevertheless took an interest in what was happening in Great Britain, in France, in Italy, and indeed also in Germany. They looked at the mass gymnastic programs of Nazi Germany, of Mussolini's Italy, even looking across the water in Great Britain to see what was happening there. And they tried to emulate the state-sponsored gymnastic programs of these countries. Being a little poorer, being a little less advanced, being a little less innovative, they chose the radio as a form to bring, quote unquote, health to the masses. And they did it through regular radio programmings. Thus, listeners to Irish radio in the 1930s could listen to a Lieutenant Teachy telling them that so-called physical culture would help embolden and strengthen Irish men and encourage a great lineage of strong Irish men to continue. They could listen to how to exercise in classrooms, how to exercise in home, and how to exercise to improve their life. So in essence, my chapter for this collection attempts to understand, unpack, and really examine the popularity of these radio fitness programs, yes, but also their meaning within that global context. These radio fitness programs were an Irish manifestation of a European problem that was intersecting with ideas of race and racial fitness, ideas of eugenics, and also ideas of national security. So to return to the odd clip that I showed you at the beginning of this brief talk, there's a lot to be learned from Irish men in all white clothing doing a series of flips, tricks, and gymnastics. And at that point, I will say thank you once more to Francois for allowing me to be part of this excellent collection, and congratulations on what is truly a milestone in a truly awful 19 months globally. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Connor. Okay, colleagues, we move to the last section of the book, Environment and Physical Culture. And I'm going to Farida Khan. The chapter is From Apartheid to Democracy, the response of Cape Town-based mountain clubs to the changing political landscape, 1970 to 1994. Farida.
Thank you very much, Professor Reddy. My aim in analyzing the response of Cape Town-based mountain clubs to the changes in the political landscape during the period 1970 to 1994 is to go beyond mainstream mountaineering in order to present a more comprehensive, diverse, and complex picture of mountaineering history. In doing so, I want to counter two prevailing myths about that history. One, that mountaineering history is apolitical, and two, that it's all about the Mountain Club of South Africa. So in this chapter, I've done this by demonstrating the inextricability of sport history and politics through exploring the history of 6 Cape Town-based clubs and showing how these clubs operated and interacted with each other in an apartheid context. These clubs are the Mountain Club of South Africa, established in 1891 as an exclusively white club, the Cape Province Mountain Club, established by colored climbers in District 6 in 1931, the UCT Mountain and Ski Club, established in 1933 as an exclusively white club. The Western Province Mountain Club, established by colored climbers on the Cape Flats in 1967. The Bats Climbing Club, an informal non-racial club established in the early 1970s. The South African Climbers Club, a non-racial club established in 1977. I show in this chapter that the politics of apartheid, that is of racial separatism and race-based socioeconomic and political inequality, dictated the development of these clubs. Hence, the mainstream white clubs, namely the Mountain Club and the UCT Club, were able to leverage their privileged position to develop into extremely well-resourced and equipped clubs with excellent infrastructure. They were also able to tap into government funding to ensure that their top climbers could travel abroad for training and climbing experience. By contrast, the colored clubs had to bear the brunt of the racial discrimination and inequality of the apartheid era. They were forced to develop in isolation as the white clubs interacted with them only infrequently and declined to share their expertise with them in any meaningful manner. Also, they had no access to government funding and struggled to obtain training and equipment for their members. The two non-racial clubs essentially catered for skilled, experienced climbers only. So while a handful of top Black climbers were in their ranks, these clubs were not in a position to contribute to the development of climbers at a broader or community-based level. As a result of the institutionalized racism and hierarchical inequality of apartheid, there was no free exchange of expertise or joint climbs, undertaken among most of the clubs. Thus, the picture for Cape Town-based mountaineering for most of this period was one of skewed and retarded development. This changed only from the 1980s onwards, when the government began to make small political concessions, signaling the start of the more dramatic changes which would later take place. This is when closer interaction finally began to take place among the clubs, and the Mountain Club of South Africa finally opened its membership to all, with its first Black member joining in 1986. That's 90 years or more after they were first established. By the 1990s, with democracy on the horizon, mainstream mountaineering had accepted that it had a vital role to play in bringing about mainstream mountaineering. Mainstream mountaineering had accepted that it had a vital role to play in bringing about transformation in the mountaineering community. And by the mid-1990s, with joint activities and social events being held among Cape Town clubs, it seemed as though a solid foundation was being laid for a close and cooperative relationship. So by this period, the future for mountaineering in a democratic South Africa looked promising, diverse, accessible, and broadly participatory. However, as subsequent mountaineering would show, this would not come to pass. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Verena. That was our last presenter of the chapters. So I just want to quickly say thank you very much to everyone who presented today, from our first three keynote speakers to the chapter presenters. Amy, Apollos, it's over to you.
Good evening again. I will just be reading the acknowledgements from the book. This publication is the outcome of an ongoing research interest in physical culture studies that was kickstarted many years ago. My first contact with physical culture was with Mona, my mother on the cover page, and Ronnie, my father pictured here. I will forever be indebted to you both for that. My interest in an alternative physical education program was sparked by lectures on a critique of fundamental pedagogics and Christian national education by Winston Cleophas in 1990, and the sociological frameworks of functionalism, conflict theories, and figurationalism by Denver Hendricks in 1987 at the University of the Western Cape. I will never forget those lectures, and it still provides my foundational analysis for physical education and physical culture. I also wish to express my gratitude towards Professor Floris van der Merwe, my PhD supervisor, for his guidance during my initial exploration of physical culture. I acknowledge the Harbier Tom Bursary Committee for providing funding for a research visit to the H.J. Lutschak Center for Physical Culture and Sports at University of Texas at Austin and the Eland family in Canada in 2017. The center unselfishly opened their archives and allowed me access to materials I otherwise would not have been able to obtain in South Africa. A special thank you to Janice and Terry Todd for your hospitality. I will always be extremely thankful for the very generous and kind manner in which Cindy Slater accessed, photocopied, and scanned hundreds of articles and clippings for me, some of which appears in this publication. The chapter on Ron Eland would not have been possible without the Eland family entrusting me with Ron Eland's archive. Thank you for letting me into the space. I hope the chapter does justice to his legacy. My visit to Canada was rounded off by the hospitality of former South Africans, family, friends, and new acquaintances. Thank you to all who shared your stories with me. A special thank you to Lillian and Joe and family for going out of your way to make my stay as comfortable as possible. Thank you to Uncle Tony and Auntie Anne Feeder for accommodating me and facilitating direct telephonic access to Precious Mackenzie through your contacts. Thank you also, Uncle Aby and Auntie Nellie, Bonnie and Patricia and families for your hospitality and driving me around. You are gone from home because of apartheid. I continue to fight the vestiges of that system. I love you always. In no small way do I owe a debt of gratitude to Dr. Hendrick Snyders for ideas around this publication. My political consciousness is shaped by the traditions of non-racialism and the movements associated with it. Some of these movements are mentioned in this volume. I remain grateful for the ideas these movements advocated in the past and remains relevant today. A special word of appreciation to Dr. Paul Hendricks and Brian Isaacs, who set examples of what it means to let us live for our children. It will not be enough to only say thank you to Michelle Heswick for supporting and motivating me to continue with what I enjoy doing, researching physical culture history. Finally, I thank all the contributors to this publication for both your patience during the process as well as your sustained effort over the years in promoting physical culture. I have worked with many of you. I met some of you through conferences or your writings, and I share the same interest as you. Physical culture at the edges of empire. Dr. Francois Cleophas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And once again, congratulations on the publication. Such a seminal publication, Francois, Dr. Cleophas. We've run our course, but there was a little thing. There could be comments from the audience, but I think the chat box has been used very well. And Vikas, is there perhaps any other input from the publisher before we conclude, before you conclude the session?
No, thank you. There's just one comment in the Q&A.
Q&A, okay, let's get it. Okay, can everybody see it or should I read it?
You can just read it. It's just...
All right, it's from Mark Fredericks. One of the fortunate ironies of apartheid was that I was exposed to fantastic teachers. Many of them were TLSA members. Many of them were also quite active within the sporting arena. I often reflect on their passion for justice, not only in education, but most certainly through sport. Their attentions to focus was The attention and focus was on the unjust system, and they rarely reflected on skin color of the operators of the levers of the system, but rather on the unjust outcomes of racist policies. Today, I often think on why it was that the ANC opted for a sporting system that required transformation, while at best abandoning a sporting system that did not require transformation, but rather formal adoption. The imperfect SACOS model was encouraged socialization across the artificial barriers of apartheid policies, and social justice was the goal, not gold medals or international prestige. Just a thought. Thank you, Mark. Well, everybody, thank you very much for being part of the launch, which included so many wonderful presentations and insights. It certainly sharpened my interest in the field, if I can call it that. I've scanned some of the chapters, but when I find the time, I'm going to sit down and read this book in one session. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions. Thank you, Vikas, for setting this up.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Final word from you, Francois?
No, just to say thank you to people who took time out. I don't have the time now to sort of sum up. I think people had a very long time, and I hope people will engage with the chapters in the book. So again, thank you to everybody who attended here tonight, from Canada, from Perth, from Cape Town. Thank you very much.
Thank you.